But I do want to get to this other point you just mentioned, which is not necessarily a majority view or overwhelming view. There are still plenty of people who hold that more European view of guns, that they should be reserved to police and military. And you actually had one of your writers articulate that view in another piece as part of this newsletter you sent out, right?
Well, that's right. So one of my reporters, Miroslava, she's let me start with the fact that she's not against gun ownership. And she says she's interested in guns. At some point this summer, I think me and my team were going to go to a gun range here in Kyiv and familiarize everyone with AKs. She's not against having a gun in her own home, and she's not against additional gun ownership in Ukraine. What she is opposing, though, is the current legislation's broad interpretation of how easily it should be, how easily guns should be accessible to the public. So right now, for example, you have to do training in order to receive a firearm, get a license to receive a firearm, and get a permit, and work through the police. And that's not something that's common in the United States. I don't think it happens anymore at all, actually. In sort of a formal legal permitting way. But here in Ukraine, there's a pretty strict check. There, you obviously have to be free of a criminal record. You need to undergo local training on firearms handling and safety, storage, that sort of thing. And then that all finalizes in getting a permit. So, Miroslava and her husband both are interested in owning a gun and familiarizing themselves with firearms. They're worried about the overproliferation of firearms. They're worried about, a post-war period where you have a lot of soldiers with PTSD coming back and re-entering a society where there is a proliferation of firearms, and therefore a proliferation of potential for greater numbers of veteran suicide. They're worried about criminals getting access to these firearms when there aren't very many firearms in civilian society right now. Those are all concerns that they are raising as part of their opposition to this particular widening of the scope for civilian gun ownership in Ukraine.
Yeah, so it's a bit closer to the more traditional European civilian view of firearms ownership, maybe even a bit to the more pro-gun than your typical European, because they do, like you mentioned, they still think people should be able to own guns, but they want those more severe restrictions on it than what this proposes. So there is I was just trying to get, there's a debate, right? There's still a strong debate. You have experience covering the American gun debate. You wrote a whole book about the NRA, and the gun control movement is mentioned in there as well. So you've got experience covering it here. What is your take on where things are at now? Obviously, it must be a very different situation in a country where they're actively at war, and has a more European Soviet background. What is your view of how things are similar and how things are different?
Well, the veil has really been lifted on violence in this society, right? So it's no longer something that just happens abstractly in really far off places. This is happening to people's husbands and sons and brothers. And so there's a deep anger and anxiety in this society. And I wonder if this is the right time to be making decisions about firearms and guns. The legislation does talk about how there is a kind of, a waiting period between when the legislation is enacted and when the rules start to take effect of several years. But you can see that, Ukrainian society has gone through the most traumatic experience in a generation. Probably the most traumatic thing since the end of World War II. I'm trying to think of any, similarly destructive events. On this scale, this is one of the most devastating things to happen to a society. There are going to be a lot of people with mental health problems. There's going to be a lot of challenges to the economy, and sudden changes to gun laws should Yeah, I think these regulations ought to be well considered in the context of broader social problems. That's my concern. As someone who's been in the U.S. military and seen evolving views of evolving views among the veterans community about suicide, depression, anxiety, PTSD. I worry that bringing a lot more firearms into civilian hands will make it easier for problems to occur after a lot of very, very traumatized people return from the front lines and try to reintegrate back into society.
Yeah, certainly. That's always a risk. But it does seem like, given how far this bill has gone, that a lot of people do share these views of they don't want to be left defenseless, right? I mean, is that, do you hear
Obviously,
that when you speak to sources in the field out there? Or?
There are so many issues going on, right? I think one thing that you put your finger on that I think is correct is that the more people have military training, the more people feel comfortable with firearms, the more people are, are interested in or able to use in a safe way firearms in a civilian setting. And that changes the whole attitude in society towards the issue of firearms ownership. And I do understand from people who have lived in areas that have been occupied by the Russians why they would never want to feel defenseless as they did and caught off guard as they did in the early days of the war. Why they would never want to feel that way again. I'm not Ukrainian, and I don't want to kind of tiptoe too far into how they should be doing their laws. But I can certainly understand why this legislation has received passage in its first reading and is on its way to possibly becoming law.